this is our last class of BHIE 141, and we are going to cover in this class Unit 14 and Unit 15. And we are going to study about the history of China and Japan until 1845. Okay, 1848. Sorry. And they have fought within, just like we have studied about in these classes, BHIE 141, the history of China, how the Communist Party and how the groups and how the organizations formed in China, and how China fought the wars with the Europeans and the Japan and other countries, and how China won in all those circumstances at that time till 1848. And this is a time period of BHIE 141. Now, in this Unit 14, China and the war with Japan. How China fought the war with Japan, and what was the reasons and what were the impact of the war of China like this. And the period of the war with Japan was also the period of Second United Front. As was the case with the first one, it was shaped by international circumstances as well as due to the dynamics of political experiences in China. You will wonder that if the first United Front had failed, then why the second United Front in the war against Japan? We have been seeing that the social and political programs of CPC, Chinese Political Party, and the Kuomintang, what is GMD, were different and opposed to each other. They were opposed to each other. They were opposing that time to each other. Therefore, there had be some special circumstances that should have made the CPC consider the fight with Japan as its first priority and to even make another united front with the Kuomintang GMD for this purpose. Next, what was the background of these wars at that time, and what was the Long March, and who had done those things at that time? Thousands of peasants had been killed by the GMD forces in the daily bombing and machine gunning from the air. Whole areas were depopulated by forced mass migrations or mass executions. The Red Army itself suffered over 60,000 casualties. However, thousands of peasant supporters fought till their last to enable the main section of the army to get away. The heroism of these Red supporters has been commemorated by the CPC. Three factors connected with the Long March helped in keeping the communist revolution alive. The Long March itself contributed to the growing reputation of the Communist and the People's Liberation Army as just courageous and truly nationalism. The Kuomintang continued to claim that the communists had been defeated for good, and their control over the press and public opinion prevented most people from knowing what was really happening in the remote regions of China. The Long March also led to a new cohesion within the communist movement in China. Mao's leadership of the party was consolidated. All along the march, when it was not possible to move further due to enemy areas, the frequent waits utilized for political education and political meetings of leadership. Third one is the most important gain for the communists was, however, the human and physical experience that the Long March gave to the thousands of cadres. It was in itself a training ground for hard physical training and political education. It brought them into contact with new regions and the different people of China. This was the result of Long March and why they had contributed in this. Next was the Yanans Yanan's strategy. What was the strategy of Yan'an? Yan'an was chosen as the new base by the communists for reasons very similar to why Kiangzi had earlier been chosen by them. As Edgar Snow pointed out, what he pointed out, Yan'an was ideally suited for defense. Cradle inbound of high, rock ribbed hills, its stout walls crawl up to the very tops. As earlier, the liberated zones were founded and on armed struggle, changes in land ownership based on peasant interests, guerrilla warfare at local levels, and location of bases in areas inaccessible to government troops. But the chief enemy for the communists at this stage was no longer the GMD. The main enemies were now the Japanese, and we are talking about the Chinese. And the main enemies of Chinese were the Japanese we are talking about. Next is international situation. What was the international situation China was facing, and with other countries, how China was behaving like? For this task, the broadest possible front had to be forged not only within China but also with the other countries fighting Japan. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 led to the formation of a broad international front against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the fascist power. Who was the fastest power? What about the fastest power? The fastest power which were held in Germany at that time, and with Germany, Italy, and Japan also they were facing these type of things. Means Germany, Italy, and Japan, the fastest power. This broad front consists of England, France, Soviet Union, and after 1941, the US, they called themselves the Allied Forces. They were the Allied Forces, who were England, France, Soviet Union, and after 1941 to 1945, at the time when the Second World War got end at that time, that is 1945. And after 1941, we are talking about US had joined Allied forces also. The social forces of national liberation too joined this broad front. For India, the choice was not so simple as she was ruled by Britain. India was ruling at that time by Britain because Britishers were ruling in India at that time. But for China, the choice was simple and straightforward because the Allies fought Japan. The Allied forces and Japan. They both are rivals, just like with Japan, Germany, Italy. Two countries were with Japan. And what about Allied forces? England, France, Soviet Union, and after 1941, US also joined the hand with Allied forces. Yes, both were rivals at that time. And what about China? Who were the rival of China? Japan. And Japan, the fastest power we are talking about. Yet for the CPC, a larger question was at stake at that time. The popular fronts against Germany, the popular fronts against Germany, Italy, and Japan also represented a fight for the survival of democracy. And the first socialist state, the Soviet Union, both of which the CPC considered as necessary conditions for their own success. That's why the victory of fascism would mean a setback and defeat for China at the hands of Japan, while their defeat would mean an independent China. In short, they perceived the world political situation and their role and place in it in very much and same way as Indian leaders did. It is not a coincidence that the process of decolonization The Indian independence and Chinese revolution followed the defeat of the fascist power in Second World War. Next is social and political resistance to Japan. The resistance to Japan aggression began immediately. The Jiangxi Soviets declared war on Japan in 1932 as a protest against the invasion of Manchuria. Although this was nothing more than a token resistance, but in the cities there were overwhelming assertion of public opinion against the Japanese. The intelligentsia played a leading role in activating public opinion and organizing boycott of Japanese goods. The student movement came to be identified with the national resistance movement. In the autumn of 1931, some 15,000 high school and university students held military exercises in the streets of capital and staged daily demonstrations to stop negotiations and force the government to declare war on Japan. The CPC, recognizing the great potential of these movements, sent out an appeal to whole country to join the communists in fighting Japan. This was in August 1935, even before the Long March had been completed and before they reached their base in Yan'an. The strategy of Chinese United Front, similar to anti-fascist United Fronts in Europe, that was already born. However, it took some more time to formulate and even more limit line to implement. The organizations and movements were as much a protest against Chinese government's policies of compromise and lack of resistance as against the Japanese. It was in this political context that the much celebrated and significant Xi'an incident took place. On December 12, 1936, Jian Jishi was kidnapped by one of his generals while on a visit to Xi'an. Chinese troops were not happy fighting with the Chinese people, even if they happened to be communist. And they presented him with eight demands. What were the eight demands? Number one is recognizing the Nanking government and admit all parties to share the joint responsibility of national salvation. Next is end all civil war immediately and adopt the policy of armed resistance against Japan. Next, release the leaders of resistance movement in Shanghai. Next, pardon all political prisoners. And fifth one is guarantee the people liberty of assembly. Next one is safeguard the people's rights of patriotic organization and political liberty. Next one is put into effect the will of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Immediately convene a national salvation conference at that time. They were the eight demands. They were the eight demands they presented in front of the government. Next is the United Front in practice. What were they doing at that time in practice? The United Front of CPC and the Kuomintang against Japan did not function smoothly at all times. In practical terms, it also means that the communists had to give up their idea of overthrowing the GMD by force as long as the Japanese remained on China's soil. This was an issue beset with many practical difficulties, social tensions, because the Kuomintang's social policies had not been modified during the United Front. Even as the CPC modified its own. And the secondly, even as the communists retained their own armed forces, they were also counted as a part of national army. and they became part of the 8th Marching Army. 8th Marching Army. The communist partisan fought bravely against the Japanese. In Hanko, the government and the communists sat together to formulate the plans for the prosecution of war. Another unit of communist army was created. In April 1931, for the first time in the history of Japan, her army suffered a defeat in China. First time. And this was, however, just one battle, only one battle. And thereafter, one place after another in China fell before the economic and military superiority of the Japanese. Everything that counted for them came into their lap. The great ports, the industrial and the commercial centers, the mouth of three main rivers, and the capital. Everything. By 1938, it also became obvious to Jiang Jieshi that because the communists were more effectively organizing the people for guerrilla warfare against the Japanese, they were winning the loyalty of the people because the Chinese people were very well versed in the guerrilla warfare and the Japanese were not. That's why that was only the reason behind before the Japanese at that time, and that was the reason by which the Japanese were lost the war. And the strains within the United Front became more acute, and Chiang again resorted to his earlier policy of blockage of red areas. In spring 1939, his troops moved against the communists in Hunan. After Hunan, Hubei, then Hebei. In November, they partially dismantled the southern part of Yan'an's base. And in January 1941, the communist headquarters were attacked and many of their leaders captured or killed. The financial aid to China in the form of 500 million US dollars came to Kuomintang in 1941 when the US joined Allied forces. And Jiang Jieshi was by now, however, more concerned with fighting the communists. Meanwhile, in early 1944, the Japanese began another offensive. In Hunan, they defeated the Kuomintang forces for a matter of weeks. In their further victories to the southwest, they also destroyed the remaining American bases. And what is the Yan'an's base and what was the form of resistance, how they resist China, how they resist Japan? Anti-Japanese democratic governments were set up in these bases in China, and the communist decision to send their forces behind the enemy lines was not the only way that these bases originated. Other fighting groups appeared spontaneously behind the Japanese lines, like the peasant self defense groups, autonomous guerrillas, groups of students, and even Kuomintang dissidents. The two kinds of efforts completed each other, this kind of warfare culminating in the establishment of red bases meant that the distinction between the military and civilians was eliminated. The military organizations ranged from regular army to regional militants and village defense groups. Even peasants who occasionally participated in military action without giving up agricultural work means second option for the peasants, just like peasantry they were doing or agriculture activities, and with agricultural activities they were doing on a part time the military actions they were participating occasionally when they had no work, then they need to train of military actions at that time. The support of peasant population was crucial in providing new recruits, giving information, providing transportation, provisions, and other help during emergencies. That was the reason. Next is the red basis, a new type of society. What type of society they were making in China at that time? Related to these reforms were measures to increase production. It was felt that if people's living standards are to improve, then production must also be made to increase. And the party, government, and army directed their best efforts towards helping the people raise their production. During the anti Japanese War, two production campaigns were undertaken by the troops and the government bodies in Shanxi Kansu border region. The first, the first ones aimed chiefly at the improvement of living conditions, and the second one, the aim of second one in the base area behind the enemy lines was started in 1942. By 1943, it had become a widespread movement in the liberated areas. This campaign was extremely successful. The area under production and the grain output increased tremendously. As a way of increasing production, improving the method of production organization, as well as introducing new forms of political education, peasants were organized into mutual aid teams and cooperatives. The principle involved in this cooperation was voluntary work and mutual benefit. That's why peasants began to experience new forms of interaction with each other through common labor, rotation of equipment. The basis of new democratic political structure was universal, with free elections at all levels village, district, and region. Everyone over 18 years could participate in elections to all the bodies, but it was ensured that of those elected, one third should be communist, one third independent left members, and one third liberals and democrats, sometimes even Gomindang members. The final phase of this Chinese revolution that was at this time the Japanese offensive also became harsher and blockade against the red areas became complete. The break with the Kuomintang was equally complete. The Japanese followed a policy of kill all, plunder all. They were following that policy. Who were following? The Japanese were following a policy of kill all, plunder all. This was an extremely hard year for the communists. And after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Americans and the British increased their pressure on Japan in China, but they pushed for their own interest. Next, from 1941 to 1943, the Japanese built enormous structure around their occupied zones and fit the edge of liberated red areas. As a result of this renewed offensive, thousands of people were massacred, harvests and villages destroyed. The population in the liberated areas was severely decimated with the regular army reduced to merely 3 lakh men in 1942. The tide could be made to turn only in 1944. The peasant militia was expanded, a final, desperate struggle ensued. In 1944, especially in 1945, the struggle was expanded. The anti Japanese movement in the enemy occupied cities and villages became more widespread and intensive. The puppet government set up in the enemy territories in north, central, South China, where also the worst plunder had taken place, were overthrown in many areas. But by April 1945, People's Army had expanded to 9 lakh 10,000 men, the militia of 2 lakh, no, 22 lakh, and the self-defense corps to 10 lakh, 1 crore men, not 10 lakh, 1 crore. 19 liberated areas had been established covering an area of 9 lakh 50,000 square kilometers, inhabited by a population of 9 crore 55 lakh. And the liberated areas occupied very important strategic positions. Most of the Japanese occupied major cities, communication lines, and coastal lines were surrounded by people's troops. And that was the Unit 14, and we were talking about the Unit 14. And let us sum up what we have studied in this Unit 14. The Long March was a great experience for the communists. In spite of retreat, they were able to ultimately consolidate their position and increase support among the people. Once the Japanese aggression of China started, the communists offered immediate resistance. Though a united front was forced with the Kuomintang, this time the communists continued to carry their revolutionary policies and the reforms in their areas of influence. A new society was created in red basis, which practically transformed all spheres of life. The People's Liberation Army and the other communist organizations played a vital role in opposing the Japanese. That was Unit 14, and now we are going to cover Unit 15. In Unit 15, we will cover the Chinese Revolution with Japan. This unit deals with the period from 1945 to 1949 when the Second World War ended at 1945, and in 19 till 1949 we will cover this time period. That is from the date of the surrender of Japan up to the period when foundation of People's Republic of China was formally proclaimed. These 4 years marked a period of civil war between the forces of Kuomintang and the communists. The civil war ended with the victory of communists. What were the observations? Some observations. In a period of less than 4 years, the Kuomintang or the nationalist government based in Nanking gradually but surely collapsed. It lost out not only in the military battles and in its inability to bring about an economic reconstruction of China in the post war years, but also because of its refusal to usher in any political or social changes. Thousands of Chinese people had already experienced a new quality of life in liberated areas during the Kiangzi and Yan'an's period. A revolution involves not only a change in the government, it involves the overthrow of an entire social order and its replacement by another, a more progressive one. Therefore, it becomes important to study the revolutionary process of this period from the point of view of the change in the correlation of social and political forces in China. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 was not a socialist revolution of the kind the Russian Revolution of 1917 was. Same. The Chinese communists themselves saw the 1949 victory as they saw just as entire outcome of the entire national movement. Next, victory of peasant struggle. Next, restoration of unity in a country which for so many years had been torn apart by conflicting forces. They called it a people's democratic revolution, which brought to political power the communists who stood for socialism. Next, post war situation and the political forces in China. After the revolution, what was the situation, what was the condition, and what they were doing at that time. The post war means after 1945, the role of China. The post war international situation was therefore in favor of the Chinese people in their struggle against the foreign powers and those forces in China which collaborated with the foreign powers. This international climate was of great advantage of the Chinese communists in spite of the fact that in the immediate aftermath of Japanese surrender, the internal balance of forces seemed to weigh heavy in favor of the Kuomintang. The areas considered as the liberated red zones had expanded during the course of anti-Japanese struggle, but then at the end of 1945, the Kuomintang still controlled the major portions of the territory. The major portions of the territory. There, the Kuomintang was controlling properly. All the international powers in 1945 gave legitimate recognition to Kuomintang's position. The Chinese communists were yet to win acknowledgement among the world powers that they enjoyed considerable support among the Chinese people. The Kuomintang was far ahead at the communists in the terms of financial resources, military equipment, control over administration, means of communication, print media, cooperation from the dominant sections of Chinese society, control over administration, means of communication. This contrasting picture between the red areas and the Kuomintang areas forms the immediate background and the social context within which the struggle between the Kuomintang and the communists took place. The success of national liberation struggle with the defeat of the Chinese led to the transformation of internal contradictions in China. The contradiction between China and Japan gave way to that between the broad masses of Chinese people represented by Communist Party on the one hand and big landlord classes, big bourgeois represented by the Kuomintang and aided by the US on the other hand. This became the principal contradiction of Chinese social and political life, the main factor dominating the domestic situation. Having won a victory over the Japanese forces, the Chinese people now saw freedom from their internal oppressors as their main task. Political democracy and social emancipation became the primary issues in China. Social, political democracy, social emancipation. They were the primary issues in China. As the civil war progressed, the Kuomintang became the main hurdle to the realizations of these aspirations. The outbreak of civil war. How the civil war outbreak at that time in China? The immediate conflict arose over Manchuria, which the communists were able to occupy. This was in spite of the fact that the Kuomintang forces at this time totaled about 3 million, while the communists had less than 1 million. 3 million of Kuomintang and 1 million of Communist Party. The Americans tried to mediate between two forces because they perceived that a civil war in China could only go against their interests. General George C. Marshall was sent by President Truman to arrange for peace in China. Jiang Jieshi refused anything short of complete control over Manchuria, where the communists now held sway. This the communists obviously could not agree to. By the spring of 1946, all possibilities for successful negotiations ended and a full fledged civil war became inevitable. Meanwhile, inflation, rising prices in Guomindang areas threatened a situation where civil war would be carried into the Guomindang areas themselves. And on the other hand, in the liberated zones, the communist leaders launched a movement against the traitors. For example, the landlords who had sided with the Japanese were denounced in village assemblies. In May 1946, the slogan of land belongs to the tiller. That is a slogan which came in May 1946. Land belongs to the tiller. That was popularized. And landlords also had to pay heavy taxes. In this way, developments in both the Gomindang areas and the liberated zones contributed towards making class struggle an important dimension of the civil war even before the negotiations had failed. The Chinese people, although sick of years of war, became prepared for another war. And this time it was for the protection of their own rights over land and over their livelihood. Next is Gomindang offensives and their defeat 1946 to 1947. Defeat of Gomindang. In June 1946, the Gomindang, with its strength of 2 million men, attacked the large communist bases in north and central China. Gomindan attacked on communists in north and central China. They pushed back the communist forces from Central Plain and the lower Yangtze region. By March 1947, they had seized Yan'an, which had been the base of communists after the Long March. Simultaneously with this military crisis of the Kuomintang, there broke out an economic crisis in the Kuomintang controlled areas caused by the collaboration between the Kuomintang and United States. After the Japanese surrender, it was the Kuomintang and not the communists to whom the Japanese had surrendered all the industrial equipment, banking, and financial institutions. The total value of these assets was $1,800 million, which was controlled by a small clique of big industrial capitalists. In fact, the capital owned by the four big families in China amounted to 70 to 80% of total industrial capital of China. During civil war itself, in November 1946, the Kuomintang signed the Sino-American Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, which opened China to American products. China was inviting American products to China. By 1947, the United States occupied a decisive role of China's foreign commerce. 51% of all imports, 51% of all imports to 22% in 1936 before the Japanese defeat, and 51% all imports, 57% all exports. If we are talking and if we want to see the economy of any country, then we should see the exports of that particular country. And what is the export? 57% export from China. That is the main thing. 51% of all imports, 57% of all exports. And management and training of personnel in many enterprises was put under American control. This all meant a virtual colonization of Chinese economy by American capital. And it completely stifled and prevented growth of China's national industry and commerce. And it was against the interest of the large section of Chinese bourgeois or entrepreneurs. In May 1947, a new May 4th movement was proclaimed. New May 4th movement was proclaimed. That was proclaimed protesting against the entire set of Gomindang policies. And this movement was met by repression. Hundreds of young people were wounded. 13,000 arrests were made in just 2 months. After a long period of inactivity, the workers' movement also picked up. In May 1947, riots, strikes broke out in Shanghai, protesting against the high cost of living and hunger. Rice riots broke out in the cities of Lower Yangtze. Cities again became important areas. The struggle against the old forces resisting change. In the countryside, in Guomindang areas, peasant agitation took the form of demonstrations, riots, refusal to pay taxes, rents, attacks on rent collectors. And in Taiwan also, there was resistance to Guomindang rule. The government again answered with brutal force. The poet Wen A Tuo, associated with the struggle for democracy, was murdered. And in May 1947, strikes, demonstrations, and even petitions by more than 10 people were banned. There remained no space for peaceful protest and no way out for those who stood midway between the Gomindang and the communist. Gomindang and the communist, except to join the communist against the repressive and authoritarian Gomindang government. We see that the communist victories of 1947 were not won by military means alone. The different form of class struggle in the areas of Gomindang and the CPC weakened Gomindang and strengthened the CPC support base throughout China. Having obtained land, the peasant enthusiastically participated in civil war on the side of communists. And the total number of Gomindang troops was reduced from 4,30,000 at the beginning of war, 3,70,000 by July 1947, while the PLA grew from 1,20,000 to nearly 2 crores. Next, we are going to cover communist victories. How victories came in front of communists in 1948 to 1949. In spring 1948, the PLA occupied the major cities along the Yellow River. They also reoccupied Yan'an, which had been their base during the anti-Japanese war and which they had been forced to abandon in 1946. In three major campaigns, later the Kuomintang forces were completely defeated. In which campaigns? The first of these major campaigns by PLA was in East China, where after 8 days of continued attack, beginning on September 16, 1948. One. Next is Sinan. The capital city of Shandong province was liberated from the Kuomintang forces. As in the earlier phase, the loss of support for the Kuomintang and increased support for the CPC were significant factors in these final victories. The Kuomintang was not able to check price rise and production came to a halt. It lost its support from the people. Who? Gominda. The communists, on their part, in 1948-49, tried to win the support of larger sections of people by adopting a more flexible agrarian policies in the new liberated zones. And they tried to be more moderate to begin with. For example, the rich peasants were not touched, and the middle class and the bourgeois were also not alienated through any measures against their interest. The effort was to emphasize national reconstruction and the popular unity of all democratic forces, which also included non communist groups who had opposed the Gominda. The idea was put forward by Mao Zedong in his pamphlet. What the idea? On the people's democratic dictatorship, and was already implemented in the newly liberated zones. Next was difficulties for the new regime. They made the new regime, and what were the difficulties they were facing in the new regime? There were still some drawbacks for the new regime. The world as a whole would not recognize the new regime. They saw in the new regime a defeat for the forces supported by imperialism, and a victory for socialism to which they opposed in principle. They forgot all talk They forgot all talk about democracy, disregarded the fact that the new regime enjoyed great popular support. They are talking about the new regime. For these reasons, many observations believe that the new communist government would not be able to survive long. But it had certain advantages also. For example, it had the support of a vast majority of Chinese people, and they saw the new regime as a new start in the history of their country and their personal lives. Many observers pointed out achieved by unpaid labor, but the masses who worked on restoration were fed and mobilized by PLA and received equal treatment with soldiers. The towns did not starve in the winter of 1949. Food was transported by barges and primitive boats 1400 miles up to the Yangtze. The army had no more war to fight. It was set to work in the cities, rebuilding shattered dwellings, public buildings, and so on. Next is new regime, economical, social, and political framework. How they were enhancing to the demand of democracy. By Mao Zedong in his essay on the People's Democratic Dictatorship, the political structure envisaged by him allowed for the participation of a very broad section of Chinese population in the political and economic life of the country. As soon as China was proclaimed a republic with communist victory, this kind of a government was established. It was a coalition of 14 parties and the groups. There were non communists both in the government as well as among the deputy heads of states. Next one is the land reforms, how they reform in the agriculture, how they reform in the land settlement. All land should be as far as possible shared out equally between the village or district. That is the land reform. Next one is the former landlords were to retain a small share equal to that of others and only to them who were prepared to work it themselves. This one is also land reform. In keeping with the broad base of new political structure, the agrarian policy was also moderate and such as to retain the support to broader sections of Chinese people in the countryside. As such, it was more moderate than the Civil War policy. It was also a policy geared to promote economic development of the countryside, reshape social and economic relations also. Agrarian reforms also helped to activate the social life in the villages. Health, literacy campaigns were conducted by peasants' associations. Activities by women's groups and those of young people also ensured the participation of all sections in transformation of the people life of the people. Next one is how they reform in industry and its management was in the hands of national bourgeois. Communists had very little control over it. Therefore, through the 1950 law, they concerned themselves primarily with labor unions, price control, distribution of primary materials, and state orders. They represented workers' interest in the factories and also carried out literacy campaigns. Private economy was allowed to develop, even make profit under the general guidance of the state. Rentlessness, relentless struggle was carried out against corruption, waste, bribery, other such evils which undermined production. Transportation, finances, commerce were also put in order. What was the social change they were facing? The marriage law of 1950 was a very important landmark in transforming social relationship. Its aim was the establishment of equal rights for women through making marriage an institution based on equality, free mutual consent. Position of women was vastly improved. Women played a very active role in productive work and the shouldering social responsibilities. They became active citizens of a new China. Marriage law was also a law for protection of children. Female infanticide was strictly forbidden, illegal to sell children, which happened frequently during the famines of 1921, 1931, 1943. Many women married against their wish, asked for divorce, and were helped by women's organizations. Significance of the Chinese Revolution. What were the significance of Chinese Revolution at that time? The significance of Chinese Revolution, just like the distribution, the destruction of old order by the successful Chinese revolutionary movement, the establishment of a people's republic, the transformation of a quality of life of a large chunk of world's inhabitants. Generally, it is recognized by the students of history that the modern ideas which emerged in the West have played an important role in transforming the consciousness of people in more backward societies. Notable among these are the ideas of liberty, idea of equality, idea of fraternity, idea of democracy, and the popular sovereignty. Yes, we must remember that the Chinese Revolution was also a major act of decolonization. Pre revolutionary China was a country led by almost all the imperialist power of the world. Its entire wealth and production was organized for the benefit of these powers. The Chinese people lived a life of acute deprivation under the system of treaties forced on China by the Western powers and Japan. They were equally the victims of the world's abuses of feudalism, represented by Chinese warlordism. Death from poverty and hunger was the norm, rather than exception for the poorer sections of the peasantry. Chinese Revolution in destroying the social and economic basis of feudalism in China also destroyed the social base of imperialist powers on Chinese soil. In their uncompromising struggle against the imperialists, the Chinese revolutionary masses also gave a rebuff to the Western powers. In assessing the significance and worldwide impact of the successful Chinese Revolution, we must look at it from an historical perspective. If we see in a very historical perspective, then both in area and population. China in 1949 was the largest country in the world. Its territory extended to 9 million square kilometers, and the population, according to official statistics, was 410 million in 1939. If we are talking about at that time 410 million population. The destruction of old order by the successful Chinese Revolution movement and the establishment of People's Republic. Therefore, the transformation of quality of life of a large chunk of world's inhabitants. If we are talking about Chinese Revolution, in bringing forth the full political potential of the peasantry, provided a blueprint for the role of peasantry in the revolutionary transformation of backward societies. Its concept of people's democratic revolution has been incorporated and adapted in program of communist parties in Asian countries. The Chinese Revolution transformed the entire spectrum of life of Chinese people: political, social, economic, intellectual, and made those major actors on the stage of world history. Now, this Unit 15 is going to be an end. We have covered Unit 14 and Unit 15. In this and in our next class, we will study about BHIE 142. And in our next class, we will study about the history of Japan. Not the history of China. We will go to study about the history of Japan in our next class. And in next class, we will study the history of Japan, how the government of Japan, how the Japanese were facing the revolutions, the things they were facing at that time. The timing will be 1948 to 1990. That timing we will be covered in our next class. So, thank you. Have a nice day.